But security experts say the scourge of violent crime is forcing South Africans to be hyper-paranoid and in a constant state of survival. The shooting of a 14-year-old boy on Tuesday by his father in Adele, south of Johannesburg, has sparked a debate on the use of guns for protection. According to Gun Free South Africa, 21 people are shot and killed every day. Now, to discuss this further, we're joined via Skype by Adele Kirsten. She's the director of Gun Free South Africa. Adele, a very good morning and thank you for making the time.
Good morning, Ayanda, and I'm struggling to hear you. It's breaking up, but I'm able to lip read a little bit, and I heard you give the data on 21 gun deaths a day. I think, the first thing to say is just the extraordinary, the kind of enormity of the tragedy. And unfortunately, this is it is a daily occurrence where the very gun and it's most often the man in the house gets the gun to protect his family and himself and his loved ones. That's the very gun that is used unintentionally or deliberately or in something like suicide against the very people whom you bought it to protect. And so that's one of the risks of having a gun in the home. So that's the one. And the other is, I think that for many of us, and maybe for most of us, we live in high levels of fear. We are scared of each other. So for me, what this incident in a way demonstrates is that our high levels of crime make us fearful of each other. So what is a knock on the window, and which in a society that does not have the levels of trauma and violence that we have would be seen as a knock for help or just coming to say hello, we interpret as a threat. So I think that's a feature across our society.
It's so important, the factors that you are pointing out, Adele.
That I think often in self-defense, guns are not effective as a means of self-defense.
The factors you're pointing out are so important, but as Gun Free South Africa, to what extent are you educating the public about these risks? The risks of using your gun for what it was not intended for.
So for Gun Free South Africa, one of our big areas is about raising public awareness and explaining to people, giving people the data, particularly around, for example, risks. Things like, not in South Africa, but data elsewhere in the world shows that gun owners are often at risk for being targeted for their guns. And in South Africa, we have something like 25 guns a day lost or stolen from civilians. So that's a big part of our task. And the second thing we do is, because I think raising awareness plays some part, but then working with communities and particularly with young people to look at ways in which to make their spaces like gun-free zones, to be working with CPFs, so to be building safer communities. And then the third thing we do is obviously lobby and pressure government to strengthen the law. Because the key thing, I guess, here is the responsibility and negligence. So in this instance, the law is very clear. You can't fire unless your target is directly in your sights. So the issue of irresponsible use of firearms, I think in the last couple of months, has been a big issue in the country.
Just in speaking about the law as well, just unpack the Firearms Control Act of 2000 for us, specifically about disclosure, how people who have firearms on them are supposed to disclose to the community they interact with.
Okay, I'm struggling. Ayanda, I think you're asking me to explain about the Firearms Control Act of 2000. So it's a good law. It's based on sort of global standards that we know work across countries with very different contexts to South Africa. And I guess some of the key provisions is that you regulate the person. And that means doing background checks. It requires spousal interviews. And a lot of that, it requires references from friends or colleagues. And a lot of that is around trying to establish whether the individual applying for a gun has a history of violent behavior, because that's the biggest indicator for a potential to use violence. There are obviously issues around age. In South Africa, our age restriction is 21. Then we have some interesting criteria, which is that if you have a conviction under the Domestic Violence Act, you are automatically excluded from even applying for a weapon. Yeah. So that's the criteria for the person who applies for a gun. And then we regulate the type of gun. So you're limited on the type of gun you can own as a civilian. You also, there are limits on the number of guns you can own. And then another significant part of our law is that there's a renewals period, recognizing that people's conditions and situation changes. And so every 5 years, if you have a handgun, you're required to renew it, and things like looking at safe storage, whether there have been changes in your marital status, in your financial and employment status. Those are all things to take into consideration. And we've seen that now. Just, I think it was on Monday, a 64-year-old man having been dismissed from his work, shooting his 3 children and himself. So these are all factors that influence the way we behave, and it's the state's responsibility to make sure that when they're issuing a license, we're talking about a lethal weapon, that only someone who is responsible, understands their responsibility, is issued with a firearm license.
Difficult line there, but a very important discussion. Adele Kirsten is a director at Gun Free South Africa. We might have to bring her into studio, but some very important points that she raised there, especially about the legislation of firearms and the handling of such.
It's an important issue, isn't it? Because, I mean, countries like America, for instance, where they have that Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, they're grappling with issues of stricter gun control. And I guess here in South Africa, we're trying to promote this culture of gun ownership, but balanced with the rights of the gun ownership as well as the responsibility.
And we're constantly thinking we have sufficiently stricter laws, but events such as this one force us to rethink whether it is indeed sufficient.
Yeah, it's all about promoting or putting paid to gun violence in South Africa. Let's move now on, and triple act